So we're at the 7th parak in Sefer Shoftim. It is scintillating. I mean, the action is packed. There's so much going on. This story really, the intrigue keeps deepening. And I'm going to say that today is a very positive part of the battle. Actually, really technically speaking, our parak Zayin, should be attached to parak Ches. But we're going to stick with the parakim, but we'll see that the battle does continue, and it's a more complicated battle as it continues later on. So we have the positive part of the battle. The second part's a little less happy. But let's start at the very beginning. Before we start today, a special thank you to Marilyn and Elliot, who are sponsoring today's learning, because they are celebrating the Shabbos for Ezra's bar mitzvah, their grandson, Be'ezrat Hashem. B'shar tov u'motzachas. There should be many, many smachot which bring the family together. Be'ezrat Hashem. We also thank Dr. David Levy, who is sponsoring Lira Nishmas, his father, Dr. Robert Levy, who is a noted author and musician and physician, and Be'ezrat Hashem, his neshama should have an aliyah. Let us learn a little bit of Torah. Here we go. Our parak is only 25 psukim, not exceptionally lengthy. Last parak, as an example, was 40 psukim. But today we're going to break it down into little pieces. If you remember where we last left our heroes, Gideon has now had this conversation and he's asked God for 3 signs. He asked the Malach for a sign, he burnt up the meal. He asked Hashem for a sign about the fleece and the water and the threshing floor and the water and the not water, and he's finally now ready to go into battle. So now is the product of his labor. He goes to battle. And we hear the following. He gets up in the morning, and remember, he's got a second name. What's his second name? He received a new name that's called Yerub-Baal. He is the one who fights with the Baal being the Canaanite god, because he destroyed the altar, he destroyed the slaughtered the cow, cut down the tree, and he goes to this place. He brings them to a place called Ein Harad. Goes to Ein Harad, and at this point in time, the encampment of all these Bedouin pillagers are lying below them in the valley. Tens of thousands of these marauders. And in the second pasuk we hear, Vayomer Hashem el Gidon. Hashem speaks to Gidon and says, Rav amasher itcha misiti es midyan biyadam pen yispoer alai Yisrael emor yadi hashieli. Hashem says, you have recruited too many people. Gidon has recruited 32,000 troops from the Israelites, and Hashem says, your army is too big. Rather, kra ba'aznei ha'am, you should call the people and tell them, anybody who is scared, go back now. Now is the time to leave. That's the first step. The next step is Gideon does this, and 22,000 leave. They say, actually I forgot there was the babysitter and I forgot an appointment, the mechanic and the car and the whole thing, and they go back off home. So they leave. So he's left with 10,000. Now he's facing well over north of 100,000, of these pillagers. So the odds are very badly stacked against them. But nonetheless, Hashem says, still not enough. Still not enough. Your army is too big. Right? If I was the commander, I'd be looking out. I'd be like, they don't look so big, right? But they're too big. He says, I want you to do something else. He says, I want you, listen to this statement in Pasuk Daled. Vayom Hashem Gidon, Oda Amrav, Horedos Amayim, bring them down to the water, ve'etzrafenu sham, and I'll smelt them, so I'll purify them there. Vayo Asher Amar Elecha Ze Yelech Itoch, Hu Yelech Itoch. V'kol Asher Amar Elecha Lo Yelech Imach, Hu Lo Yelech. So I'm going to tell you who's coming and who's not. What is the experiment? He brings them down to the water, and Gideon says, Kol asher yaroik bilushanoi min hamayim kasher yaroik hakelev tatzigos olevad kol sheyichra al birakov lishtos. Says we're going to separate the people who go down and bend down on their all fours to get the water to drink, and those who bring the water up to their mouths. And he says anybody who brings the water up to their mouths is going to be part of the army that you're going to use, and everybody else not. What are the odds? The psukim tell us that 9,700 bend down on their all fours to drink, leaving 300 soldiers. At which point HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, fantastic, this is your fighting force. Right? Can you imagine? So we've gone from 32,000 recruits down to 300 recruits. That's right. It's a significant diminishment of our forces, and now you're ready for battle. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says. So just before we go a little further, just a few observations. First of all, just Ein Charad. Where is Ein Charad? Okay, just come with me to page 3 for a second. Yeah, you'll notice that the Gideon is from the tribe of Yisachar, right? So it's in the area of the lower Galilee, just above the mountains of Menashe in the lower Galilee region. And I actually put the map that just of Ein Charad today. Ein Charad actually happens to be a kibbutz. They put a kibbutz Ein Charad in this location of the Ein Charad of the biblical times. In fact, just in case you're interested, there was a political debate there in the 1940s. Were they Mapai or which side of the political spectrum? And so they actually split up. There were two Ein Charads in the good days for those who've ever been to Me'uchad, and there's two Ein Charads, but nonetheless, Ein Charad Me'uchad, you can see it here in the center of the picture. It's just above the Gan Hashrosha National Park. That's where it is, and I zoomed in just to see it on the bottom of page 4. You can see the Ein Charad Me'uchad, that's on the right-hand side. And what's interesting is you'll notice that there's a Ma'ayana Charad National Park Gideon Spring on the bottom left. What does that mean? Is they have a spring which they say is in fact Gideon Spring. I put a picture on the top of page 5. This is the spring which they say right near Ein Charad is the spring which is where this incident occurs. Do we have the DNA evidence of the soldiers drinking from the water? We don't. But this is the tradition. And Yalut is this particular area. So now, I ask you the next question, which is, why is it that Hashem is thinning out the troops? So you say the following. Well, the first thinning out, right, the first level, makes a lot of sense in a certain fashion, because we know that the Torah actually recommends this. The Torah tells us in Devarim that the Shotrim would go through the people and take out all people who have new relationships in their life, whether they've just got married, soldiers who got married, or they've just settled down, right? And those soldiers are dismissed. But there's another group of soldiers dismissed, and then the pasuk says in Devarim, I put it in source 5, anybody who's scared, please leave now. Why? The pasuk in the Torah tells us, you should not melt the hearts of their brothers like their own. It's interesting. I was speaking to a fellow who works in a very special unit in the army. The unit doesn't have a name, and he does operations which are not recorded. And so he was sent into Damascus just a number of months ago for an operation, which was a very dangerous operation. But it involved taking parts of the army that hadn't ever gone into these locations. And he was describing how he had to take these other soldiers with him, but they were wetting their pants because they were so scared. It's so terrifying where the places they went. And he was saying how difficult it is to have a elite unit which does operations in crazy places, taking soldiers who are used to regular battlefields, and the danger of taking them, because what a liability they are. He needed to have them. They were Chevra Kadisha because of the job they were doing. But the danger, if you have with you soldiers who are wetting their pants, right, who are scared about what they're doing, everybody else is going to get scared. So the Torah says we don't want those people in battle. And so the first stage of this conversation makes a lot of sense. Rather to have a strong fighting force who's running into battle than those who are a little scared and are going to now create friction internally. The second stage doesn't make sense, right? The second stage doesn't make as much sense. This drinking test, right, just doesn't make so much sense. So already here we see that there's a very important observation. Rav Kashtil, I just met him in Israel recently, and I obtained one of his svarim on Tanakh. He's a teacher of Tanakh in Eli. And he makes the observation, which I think is a very, very profound observation, which is that many countries will defend themselves for territory and for food, right? That's the history of countries' war and territorial dispute. But Hashem is making sure this is not about territory or food. He's saying you're fighting about something else. What is that something else? So Rashi points out a very simple thing, is that this is sort of like a Rorschach test, over here. What's happening is he says drink water, And people who are very comfortable in the kneeling position obviously have other faith in their meaning your natural position to go down when drinking is to a kneeling position. It probably means you're kneeling to something else, which means that this is a religious separation process. I am saving you because of monotheism, not because of dualism. You're not going to be bowing to anybody else. And this is the test to see this. That's what Rashi says, and that's probably the most likely explanation. If you're used to bowing, you'll bow down wherever you go. I remember when I was in school, the principal of my school was it was very important to her that whenever we did plays, and the art department, the drama department of the school always has great ideas, but they never have the kids kneeling, right? Don't have the kids kneeling, because Jews don't kneel, right? We don't kneel to somebody else, right? So in the precinct of the Beis Hamikdash, we have the opportunity, but that's why even on a Yom Kippur, when we bow down, we're supposed to put a mat beneath our knees or our hands, so we're not prostrating on the floor. It's not appropriate for Jews to kneel or prostrate. So this is what seems to be said. But, and this part I always quote to my kids at the supper table. The next part, which is the two other observations. The Malbim says, you know what it is? He says it's because these are people who are clearly what the words he uses is they are bulmus hata'ava. These are people who you give them something to eat and they just stuff it into their mouths, right? We don't want such unrefined soldiers in this particular spiritual mission. If you can't control yourself, then you're not going to be fighting God's battle. The way the Ralbag says it is sort of the flip side of this, which is laziness. Right? If you don't have the ability to pull up the water to your mouth like a human being, and like a dog, you stick your face into the stream, right? Then you're just lazy. It's the path of least resistance. We don't want soldiers for that spiritually refined battle this is going to be as well. I always tell this to my kids, because when the soup course comes in, it's always fascinating to me to watch is whose soup comes up to them and who comes down to their soup. And I observe that if you watch, my grandmother used to have a dog called Samantha. Samantha was a cross between a Labrador and a Ridgeback, and she was a wonderful, wonderful dog. But whenever you would feed her, 5 o'clock, 5 o'clock was her feeding time, and 4:45 she was already pacing around the house, and you'd pour the dog food into the bowl before it was even hitting there. She was eating, and the food was flying in every direction, right? And that's fine. That's a dog. But human beings shouldn't be like that, right? Your food shouldn't be going there. Your nose shouldn't be in the bowl, right? So the point is that's the Ralbag the Malbim says is we're refining the character of who is representing Israel over here. Is it this easy? Is it easy to find a fighting force like this? Perhaps not. But in this case, Hashem says, I want it to be the most refined force right now. So we're down from 32,000 to 300. We have our battle of our 300. So what happens? Let's return to Apsukim, because now we get back into the story. Amazing is that it seems that Gideon is still a little nervous. How do we know he's nervous? Because Hashem says to him, if you're nervous, right, which means he's nervous, if you're nervous, go and listen. Go with Pura Narcha. Pura is his assistant. Go to the camp, sneak in at night to the encampment of the Midianites and listen to what you hear. So off he goes. He and Pura go off and they sneak down and they go off and they're listening. So listen to what happens. They're in Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vayavo Gidon v'hinei ish mesaper l're'eu chalon. And he happens to be behind a rock, he's listening, and he hears a Midianite talking to his colleague. And the fellow is describing a dream he had. He woke up in the middle of the night having a dream. I saw this large, bread made of barley, which was sort of rolling through the Midianite camp. And it came to a tent. And it broke the tent, and it turned it over, turned the entire tent upside down. And the tent fell down. What a dream, So if I was his friend, what I would say? I would say you had too much talent. Just go take chamomile tea, and it's all right? So, but his friend turns to him and says, "Vayan ra'eyu vayomer ein zois." Bilti im cherev Gidon ben Yoash ish Yisrael. It must be Gideon, the son of Joash, is coming from Israel. It's his sword. Nosan elakim biyadoi es Midian v'eskol machaneh. Hashem has given the entire camp to the Midianites. Wow, That's pretty articulate, right? So Hashem has expressed this. So by the way, there's so much symbolism in this dream over here, and it seems to be that Hashem is recognizing that Gideon is probably looking at his fighting force right now, right? And if you can see the entire line of them right now, right, because all 300 of them is not so much, and then you look down the valley and you see tens of thousands of people, Gideon is probably entitled to be quite nervous right now, which is why he seems to be receiving this dream. But let's think about the symbolism of this dream for a second, right? So the first thing to notice is just the items in the dream. The two items in the dream are this barley bread rolling, this large barley bread, and then this tent, which is being destroyed and turned upside down. So obviously, clearly the symbols are metaphorical for the Israelites, representing those who are just producing their harvest. This is now the time that they're producing harvest, so that's the barley. And the Midianites are the ones who encamp in the tents. They come and take, like the locusts, all their belongings. So it's the barley metaphor, so to speak, Israel turning over the tent of Midian. So the mechanics of the two items makes a lot of sense. But it's augmented by the fact that Malbim observes that if you remember, in the conversation that happened in last week's Perek Vav, do you remember what happened? It describes how the angel comes and sits under the tree, turns to Gideon and says, "How peace should be upon you, O strong one." And he says, "How could it be? Hashem took the nation out of Egypt and He saved them, and now look what's happening. Why are we going through this?" And the Malbim says, "Why was Gideon referencing Egypt?" It says because it was the night of Pesach. It was the 15th of Nisan. And he says, I was just reading the Haggadah, and I was just talking about the ideas of Betseis Yisrael Mitzrayim. Why is that not the reality we're looking at today? Which is why his question and complaint to the angel was such. If that's the case, and now we're at the second night, which is the 16th of Nisan. The 16th of Nisan, of course, is a very appropriate time to be talking about barley, because that's the day of the bringing of the Omer, which would be the time where the barley crop is coming into fruition, which makes a lot of sense, which is why the Midianites are here, because they're just about to harvest their fields. So it obviously is very connected to what we'll call the agricultural cycle of this moment as well. What is fascinating over here is the response of this colleague, this Midianite colleague, right? It's so precise, right? Meaning, how does this work? And Rabbeinu Bachai says an amazing thing in the Torah. He says, in the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev, if you remember, Yosef has a dream, and he comes and tells his brothers, and there's these sheaves of wheat, and there's 11 of them, and they're bowing down and things like this, and the brothers say, Hamaloich timloich aleinu. Are you going to rule over us? My Rabbeinu Bachai says, who said that's what the dream means? Like, how are they projecting their personal fears in this case? Rabbeinu Bachai says no. Hashem actually gave them a little bit of insight as to what the real meaning of that dream is, which is why they were so threatened to it. It wasn't their projections. God gave them the intuition as to what was really going on. And he says the same thing over here. God gave the intuition of the colleague of Gideon that ultimately Gideon is coming and Israel's going to win. Now here's the funny thing. You want to notice this? Think of the irony. The irony is, here is Gideon, who's required, if you've been counting signs now, 4 signs. He's required the meal being burnt, the fleece being wet, the fleece not being wet, and now the dream, right? So there's been 4 signs that he's going to win this victory. And so if you ask the average Israelite, do you think you're going to win? They're like, I hope so, right? But if you ask the Midianites, he's like, Gideon's going to kill us. So there's an irony over here, is that in the interpretation of the dream, the Midianites know, but the Israelites don't know. And that's something historically true all the time. We had the chance to meet earlier this week Rav Rimon, and Rav Rimon was just here, and he said a very beautiful thing. He said that he published a Megillah called Megillat HaTekuma, where he wrote about the miracles in the last war, just the amazing things that have been going on. And he said he got a call from Malal, which is the head intelligence agency in Israel, and they said, your Megillah has been translated into various languages, and the UAE, the president of the UAE has read it and was so inspired by your Megillah that he wants you to come visit. And so there was the Jewish rabbi from Israel giving a shir in Dubai, right, about the miracles of Israel. Because what's funny is sometimes The outsiders realize more than we do, right? And this is just what's interesting that's going on over here is here the Midianites seem to be very cognizant of the impending disaster, and the Israelites are still trying to figure it out. And it always works this way in history. So let's move forward. So now he hears the dream. Gideon now knows this battle is going to work. I have very few troops, but somehow this battle has to work. And he says an interesting thing. Let's go back to our Psukim from Psukim Tezvav to Yud Ches. And he says an interesting thing. He comes back invigorated. In Pasuk Tezayin he says, Vayachatz es shlosh me'os ha'ish shlosha roshim. So he divides them up into three separate sections of soldiers as he makes his attack. So he asks each of them to hold a torch. And he's going to hold a torch in an empty pot. Right? So the pot is a pot of earthenware. And they're going to now be prepared for battle. He says, such a beautiful line. Mimenu tiru v'chein tasu. See me and do what you see. We're going to approach in the darkness, because remember their torches are shielded by the pots that they're in. So in utter darkness they approach the side of the Midianite camp. As I'm about to do, so shall you do. I'm going to blow the horn of battle. And you will now make the same noise. You'll call out to Hashem and to Gideon. And at that point in time, you'll break the pots, he tells them, he continues to say. And immediately, you can sort of imagine the Midianite experience. From their perspective, suddenly noise and light appears all around them. Right? Because it was silent and it was dark. The pots break, the torches show, the horn blows, and suddenly, on all sides, they're surrounded by light and noise. And you're going to call out the battle cry, La Hashem Ulegidon. Let's just finish the battle. We'll come back and reflect on a few points. And so this is what happens. They blow the three different heads on different sides of the camps. They break their pottery and they attack. And it's an amazing thing happens is that the Midianites are completely astounded. They're not expecting anything. They were suddenly shaken up, and it says in Pasuk Chav Beis, Vayisku shlosh meos hashafros. They blow 300 of the horns. Vayosem Hashem es cherev ish b're'eyu v'kol machaneh vayonos hamachne ad beis hashita tzreirasa ad sas avel mechola ad tabas. And the Midianites start killing each other. They don't know what's going on. Who's the enemy? Where's the enemy? We don't know. There's pandemonium. They start running eastwards to the Jordan. And at this time, he now calls out the people of Naphtali. He calls the people of Asher and Manasseh, and because these are all surrounding tribes in the north. And he says, pulls them together to help pursue them. And he sends a message to the tribe of Ephraim. And he says, Ephraim, close the riverway. Right? Because if you look at the map, remember, if they're coming from the north of the Kinneret and they're moving to go across the Jordan obviously gets smaller and smaller the further south you get, right? Because it's bigger as you out of the Kinneret. And he says, close the crossings, because Ephraim is by the areas of the weakest areas of crossing. Close the areas, and that's what they do, bringing them all together. And ultimately, he kills the two kings of Midian. Their names are Ze'ev and Orev, which literally means raven and wolf, and they stop most of the Midianites going across the Jordan. We'll continue because the battle's not finished right now, but at this point in time, this is what we have. What's interesting is if you look in Pasuk Chaf at the very top of page 3, when they actually go into battle, they call out Vayikru'u. The battle call is Cherev, the sword, La Hashem Ulegidon, to God and to Gideon. So a lot of things to notice over here. Is the first thing to notice is this battle cry, the one that he tells him. He says, as you run into battle, he said you should say to God and to Gideon, right? That's a strange battle cry, right? That's a strange battle cry, meaning why is his name there, right? God, I get it, but Gideon, why is he in the battle cry? So interestingly enough, there are a few observations, and so the Radak says he's acknowledging that God operates through human action. So God is winning this battle. I'm the vehicle through it. So Hashem is driving. I'm the truck, right? I'm the vehicle through which God is operating. That's what he's saying. But interestingly enough, there are other explanations. As an example, the Malbim says, was this a miraculous or a supernatural victory? Right? Because on the one hand, it was building up to be a supernatural victory, right? Meaning thinning of the troops, Not 300 people versus over 130,000 people, right? So it sounds like it's going to be a supernatural victory. On the other hand, he's making battle plans, right? So this is subterfuge. He's dividing his troops. He's got a plan, right? Noise, light, surprise. These are all military preparations. So is it miraculous or is it supernatural or natural? The answer is a little bit of both. And that's why there's both those words in the battle cry. La Hashem, it's supernatural, but Legidon there's a commander doing this, right? So he's acknowledging both of these things. We're going to see later on in his life that he's going to cloud these things. These things are going to get cloudy because the role of humans in this is going to be confusing later on to him and his sons and the rest of Israel later on. But right now, it seems very powerful. It should not be here.
Also, though, if you go back to the barley dream, he said that was what they said.
Excellent. So that was what I was about to say. Took the next sentence out of my mouth, which is he's relating to the dream. If he knows that the talk at the coffee station in the Midjanat, war kitchen is about this fellow called Gidon, he wants them to hear that he's coming, right? So let me use all the psychological warfare I can. I want them to know that their dream is happening, or rather, their nightmare is happening right now. So he's utilizing the psychological warfare that's going exactly, precisely. That's exactly what I would suggest is going on over here. Now, you notice that when they actually use the battle cry, they add a word. He says you should say La Hashem u'legidon, and they say Cherev La Hashem u'legidon. The sword is to Hashem and Gidon. One thing to notice, there is no sword, right? If you're doing a calculation, let's do a quick calculation about the number of hands people have, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a pot, there's a torch, and there's a shofar. We're out of hands. Right? There's no hands. Right? So if you're holding all of those and you're breaking the pots, you can arguably keep the shofar in your mouth, but there's no extra hands for swords. Right? We're talking about farmers. We're talking about people who probably don't have arms. Right? So this is the only subterfuge they're able to do. The sword that people are falling on are Midjanat swords upon themselves. Right? That's what's happening. So the irony is the sword which is absent, which is part of their battle cry. But it should also remind us of a word that we heard already last week. And that is if you remember in the test number 2 and 3, which Gidon asked from Hashem, what was it? He puts the fleece on the threshing floor and he says, is it charev? What's charev mean? Dry. So in a certain sense, you wonder if the battle cry is relating to Hashem, like you made it dry and you made it miraculously that we were separate from the Midjanat, let us win this one. I wonder if that is part of it as well. This, of course, does bring me back to sort of one of the incredible victories and miracles in the last century, which is the Jewish conquest of the city of Tzfat. So if you remember just the numbers in the city of Tzfat, there were well over 10,000 Arabs living inside at the time, and the Jewish population was around 1,500 at the times of Milchemet Ha'atzmaut, the War of Independence. And it was in this battle, the Arabs had irregulars joining them, and they took the British police station so that the high ground above, if you go to Tzfat, it's all on a mountain, right? So the Jewish quarter is lower. The Arabs controlled the higher city and the police station. So they were there, and as the Arabs were once, they threatened, and it was probably going to happen. It would be a complete massacre once they took over the city. And the Jews invented a very Jewish invention. It's called the Davidka, right? The Davidka was kind of like a mortar, but it made more noise than damage, right? And the Palmach took just a position north of the city. And as the war started grinding into being, they were shelling the city and they were using the Davidka. The Arab irregulars actually managed to bring in mortars. They were going to lose this battle. But then, miraculously, in May 1948, it started raining. It never rains in May in Israel. Right when Pesach comes, we're done. And the rain started coming. And if you remember that this is now just 3 years shy of the end of the Second World War, and the Palmach spread the psychological warfare, the fear, and they said, it rains when you hear these noises and there's an atom bomb, right? And the Arabs believed this while they were hearing the Davidka roaring and they were seeing the rain coming, and they left. All 10,000 Arabs left Tzfat. By the way, these are the people they want right of return. They want to come back to Tzfat. It's not like they want to come across the Gaza border. They want to repossess Tzfat. That's one of the areas, the refugees, right? But this was the reason why we have Tzfat today was of this incredible, and it always brings me back when I think about Gideon's miracle. We were outnumbered and we were out-weaponed, but we did have a lot of noise and light, right? That's kind of what we had, and more than that, we had La Hashem, Ula Gideon, right? And this victory comes up again and again and again. I put it actually in the sources, just a picture of that Davidka as well. And another piece which I just think is very, very powerful to be aware of, and this is, to me, is so emotionally, it just so powerful, is on page 7. I put a picture of the officers' training course in Israel, and this is where they train officers. So when you have the soldiers who excel and they go to a course Ktsinim, they're going to be now elevated in their service in the army. Actually, I think Michael went to the course Ksinim. We were in the Shloshim for Michael Jacobowitz, who excelled in the army. Went to this course Ksinim. At the location where they train the officers, they have the pasuk from Ar Perek, which is the emblem of what it means to be a soldier in Israel, which is Mimenu tiru v'chein ta'asu. What you will see I do is what you will do. And unlike the Egyptians, whose officers were in the back as they send their troops out into disaster, the Israeli officers go straight into battle. In fact, the Israeli officers are always in battle. They remove all insignias of rank in battle so that snipers should not know who is who. But the officers are always with their troops in battle. Many times they are first and last in any battle as well. And this is very much from Tanakh, is what you see me do is what you'll follow. And I just found it so emotional that in a modern day Israel, in a military establishment, training the leaders of the army is the way we learn from Gideon. There's going to be things we're not going to learn from Gideon later on. But this is a profound example of what it means to be a Jewish soldier. You see it even quotes it, Shoftim, Perek Zayin, Posek Yud Zayin. It's there written in metal on the over there. Now, just an interesting thing is that although Gideon turns away recruits at the beginning of the battle, it seems that after the battle begins, he calls everybody. He calls the people of Naphtali and Asher, and he calls the people of Ephraim to close the banks, and he's going to be very angry with those who do not help him later on. He's going to execute those who do not help him later on. So he's very into this. So what's interesting is that perhaps he was acknowledging Hashem, you wanted to be miraculous and you wanted to be one of the most pristine of troops at the beginning. I agree with that, but he seems to have a different agenda, which is he seems to have a national agenda, which is he's no longer a localized leader, much like Devorah in that respect as well. He wants it to be that everybody's part of his effort. This is not a problem of Yisachar and Naphtali. This is a problem of Israel as a whole, and he expects everybody to show up as well, which seems to be this pivoting over here. National leadership is not just focusing on the immediate needs, which is what he does over here. I just put a picture of the actual battle, of what it looks like, from a topographical perspective on top of page 8. It's a little hard to see because I made it too small, but essentially in Ein Harad is where it's taking place. They run to the Jordan Valley. They try to cross the Jordan lower down. That's where he asks the men of Ephraim to cut off the Ma'abarot. Now, you might be aware of that it's made famous in the last few years. There was a movie called 300, right? And it was making famous a very famous battle of the Spartans led by Leonidas the First, who was a very famous Spartan king. And the Spartans were a very violent, military culture. The Athenians were sort of more cerebral. The Spartans were very much a military culture. And there's a very famous battle, the battle which is called the Battle of Thermopylae, which, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Thermopylae, thank you. This was especially evident, I can blame anything on an accent here, just to understand the details of this battle in source 13, this is especially evident in the Battle of Thermopylae, waged between the Greek and Persian forces in the late summer of 480 before Common Era. From a numerical standpoint, the massive Persian force led by King Xerxes. Who's Xerxes? Many suggest that's Achashverosh, okay, but this is one of his pushes west. Should we have easily wiped out the small Greek defense gathered at Thermopylae and continued on to victory against a seemingly inferior and disunited Greece. Instead, the Persians faced a prolonged 3-day battle against a small Greek force led by King Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors. The battle may have ended in defeat for the Greeks, yet it failed to crush the Greeks' morale and unity inspired by Leonidas' heroic example, and the Persians were defeated soon after. So Leonidas actually lost the battle after 3 days, but they put up enough of a fight that this idea spread, and ultimately they were able to push back the Persians. This is sort of like this is the age of empires, right? So we have the Greek Empire and we have the Persian Empire. Ultimately, the Greeks are going to win, right? So we know from our perspective in the Middle East, we first had the Persians and then we had the Greeks. But at this point in time, the Persians are pushing outwards west, and when they got pushed back by the Greeks, ultimately to take over, and that's when Alexander the Great sort of takes over the entire Persian Empire. But be it as it may, this is the battle of legend, is the Battle of the 300. And it's interesting because everybody says, oh, is that interesting? Here you have a much smaller army of 300 outmatched by a much larger army. They win or they hold off to a certain point. What do we make of the parallel? So you'll have some people who say, and this you'll hear some academics as an example, this is in the Ancient Warfare magazine, make the observation that the text of the passage in Judges, and it goes on to describe the language over here, sounds like what's called documentary hypothesis, which is heresy, which is there are different authors to the Bible, and they call this area Deuteronomic history, which they say was actually a later author who edited it back. And he says maybe that the Bible edited in the story of Sparta into Gideon to describe, so using a well-known legend to help describe it. So this the later editor of the Bible incorporated this. So a few things just to be aware of is, number one is just in observance of this. First of all, myth and legend. Just to understand the numbers for a second. In the battle Thermopylae, the myth is that 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians confronted an army of more than 1 million Persians. That's what you'll see if you watch the movie, and if that's your source of educational prerogative. But the history is that according to compilation of records by Herodotus and Diodorus, the total size of the Greek army was initially between 5,000 and 8,000 men. The most numerous groups consisted of Arcadians, Thespians, Phocians, Locrians, and Malians. However, the majority of the Greek troops withdrew from the area early in the morning on the third day of the battle, when the Persians, helped by the betrayal of Ephialtes, surprised the Greeks by attacking them through the secret mountain pass known as the Anapia. Only the Spartans, 298 combatants and their escorts, 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans remained there to delay the Persian army, while the other Greeks retreated to seek reinforcements and organize a stronger defense line southern. So, meaning to say, there were many more Greeks. They betrayed them and they left them behind in this battle. And he says, moreover, the Persian army was significantly smaller than popular belief, even though the total number of Persian citizens mobilized by the king of the world for the invasion of Greece could be more than 1 million. The number involved in the battle of Thermopylae is estimated from 70,000 minimum to 300,000 maximum. So meaning the numbers are just quite different to the way it's portrayed. Moreover, just in terms of timeline, when does Judges take place? When does Gideon take place? This whole story. This story takes place, we're looking around here about 1100 BCE. 1100 before the Common Era. This story of the Battle of Sparta over here takes place in the year 480 BCE, which means that we're talking about a 700-year gap. I mean, it's just to say that the editor later on sort of imputed this as well is really quite a we'll call it poetic license. But more than that, it's worthwhile noting is that the Spartans themselves actually view themselves as a kinship of the Judeans. Here is what Josephus records in a letter between Arius, the king of the Lacedaemonians, to Anias. Anias was one of the priests or one of the leaders of the Jews at the time. And he says, "We have met with certain writing whereby we have discovered that both the Jews and the Lacedaemonians are of one stock and are derived from kindred of Abraham. It is but just therefore that you, who are our brethren, should send to us about any of your concerns as you please. We will also do the same thing and esteem your concerns as our own, and will look upon our concerns as in common with yours. And he gives a sign of the person bringing the letter that this is actually true as well. Right, by the way, if you ever want to, you can get the audiobook of Josephus. It's 35 hours long, but if you have long car rides, it's really wonderful. And you could actually do this. So I have this playing from time to time in between because it really is fascinating, the parts of history you don't get to hear about. But this is where he talks about Arius. This is before Alexander the Great. This is before the Greek conquest, which means that the Spartans themselves actually view themselves as a kindred of Abraham. Who are they exactly? There's articles which are written. Are these perhaps the tribe of Dan, which moved northwards? Is this perhaps the tribe of Shimon, which left early? Is whatever the background is as to how the Spartans could have been, and their sort of their image of Samson, all the fascinating connections. But be it as it may, at least at this point in time, they view themselves as kindred or connected to the Judeans, to the Jews. So I ask you now, is who's more likely to be copying whose story, right? In terms of the way you put it down in history, it would seem to me that it is the Greeks who are copying a 700-year-old story using a biblical narrative to be able to describe or to make this icon of triumph of the Spartans themselves, which comes directly from our Perek. There is one other battle over 300 which should be important that we should notice, and that is an earlier battle which has already seen parallels, and that is the Battle of Avraham. Avraham Avinu fought against 4 aligned kings in the neighborhood. Not for now, but it's fascinating to identify who those kings are and where they come from. We've identified them in history. It's fascinating. But he has 318 men against these massive armies. And yet, like Avraham Avinu, is able to vanquish them as well. And it should be no mistake that the picture of Avram destroying the idols of his father, that medrash we looked at last week, is very much parallel to Gideon destroying the idols of his father, leading them into battle ultimately for the sake of what God says as well. The parallels abound in this respect as well. We'll hold it here. We're actually in the middle of the battle, so please don't go anywhere between now and next week, because I want to make sure that we get to the rest of the battle. But Be'ezra Hashem, I look forward to